Hi and welcome to my session. I'm very happy to be here. My name is Sebastian Daschner. I'm from Germany, Munich, and it's my very first time in Sweden and first time in Stockholm. And I'm going to talk about how to put back REST in Hypermedia with JAX-RS and Java EE technology. So about myself, I'm a Java developer, architect, consultant, however you call it, a freelancer from Munich, Germany. I participate in the Java community process in the JAX-RS and JSON-P expert group specifications for the next Java EE8 update. And I'm a so-called Java champion and rockstar speaker of last Java 1 and a conference speaker, yeah. What's going on over there? Yeah, more slides about myself. I'm offering some workshops and trainings about enterprise applications, enterprise software, and also hypermedia. And all that can be done in-house in companies or virtually on demand in English or German. I'm currently learning Spanish, but that's it with languages, so no Swedish yet, sorry. And yeah, that's all with the slides, because slides are boring and we want to do some live coding, right? So, who of you has been using REST in projects, or at least what was considered to be REST? Okay, almost everybody, that's good. And yeah, what's it all about, REST? So sometimes I say like REST, how it's supposed to be. So let's do some coding examples here. It's supposed to be HTTP examples. So imagine you have some sophisticated REST API. And since we are in Sweden, we want to talk about, like, I arrived last night and I was pretty shocked with the weather. I mean, Munich isn't that warm right now, but that was like, wow, just a couple of meters to the hotel. And so let's talk about skiing and snow and all that. For example, we have an application Duke, you know, Duke, the Java mascot, ski resort. Right? And if we have some REST API, you of course post something to a method like at that nice resort we want to book a room. So book room, right? You post something there to that URL, which of course is called like a method. And then as always you have some XML, right? Request with some parameters, right? You have a request object with param1 and param2 and so on and so forth. And as a response, you get back, of course, 200 OK, because everything's 200 OK, right? And you get a response back with a value and so on and so forth. So who has seen something like that and was called REST in projects, right? Yes, exactly. And it doesn't even matter if you use post here to post something, to call a method that does something, or actually you do the same thing to retrieve some information. So in the same case, you get 200 OK, and of course you get some information back. But, well, if you look at that example, first of all, you're not using HTTP with here the HTTP verbs, how it's meant to be used, like you're posting something which is actually meant to create a new resource on your server. And we also have more status, HTTP status codes, but yeah, that's another story. But also the commands you're calling here. I really say commands because you're accessing the resource book room or get rooms. You're calling a method, right? And if you think about that, it actually looks like SOAP without the SOAP envelope, XML, and yeah, that's it. So basically you had done not much else than you implemented SOAP in a more lightweight solution. But so what's REST is about? It's about resources. And what are these? So the resources should reflect the domain entities and business objects you have in your application. And these should be reflected by the URL. What does that mean? If we have our nice Duke ski resort, it has rooms, it has probably some people and employees and so on and so forth, and these objects should be reflected in the URLs. That means, for that example, you have the list of rooms as a resource. And you can query that resource using HTTP get rooms, which probably gets you a list of all rooms available. In 200 OK, either XML or JSON, or the representation actually doesn't really matter. Let's say rooms, you have a room, and the room has a name and a capacity and all that, and then you have another room, and so on and so forth. So now, what did we change? We have now a representation of our domain entities. In this case, it's rooms. In this case, represented by XML, but it doesn't matter. And you get that back directly by querying a get against that resource, get rooms. For example, let's do something else. We also have an ID for the room, which is here 1, 2, 3, 4. It's called Duke's room, capacity of 4 persons, and of course copy paste that, that's faster. And another room, Duchess, or however that is pronounced, that's the girlfriend, the female version of Duke, and that's another room. So now that's probably something you have seen in project as well. You can get the assumption that you can now call get room / 1, 2, 3, 4 if you want to follow. If you want to follow that resource here. So this is the list of rooms, right? And if you now want to get one specific single room, you can do so by combining this URL plus the ID. Who has seen something like that in projects? Yes, yeah, this is quite common. First of all, what did we do here? And now it's the same example with 200 OK, you only get one room back. Now we introduce resources, which is good first. What did we do else? We now have the assumption how the URLs look like, because you as a human, you look at the resources and you know about your business use case. You know that this Duke ski resort is talking about rooms and it has capacities and all that. And then you can assume how to use that API, because that's what it's going to be about. You have to use this REST API at the end. And now you kind of assume as a developer, room / 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 / the room ID is probably going to give you back some room. And now what we actually, if we actually want to create a new room, for example. So we post here something to the rooms resource, and now this is actually the application of the HTTP principles, because we are now using the correct HTTP verbs, post, to post a new resource on the server, which is true, rooms, you're creating a new room. And of course, as a request body, you have the room with, let's say, a name and a capacity, and you're posting that, and then you get not 200 OK, but there are actually more status codes. In that case, it's 201 created back, and you get a location header, which then points to the URL of the newly created room on the server. Who has seen something like that? Yes. And this is exactly the point where Hypermedia kicks in. Because in Hypermedia, what's the concept about? You want to link to resources that are somewhat related to your current resource, either in HTTP headers or directly in your response. So this is supposed to be an HTTP header, and it links to the location where your newly created room now resides on the server. And having that said, you can later on follow that link by calling get rooms 3456, and then you're gonna get that back. And if we apply that principle further and say, okay, now we don't want the client to assume where that room, where these rooms reside, and we get rid of these IDs and actually provide something similar, like a link, which then points to the rooms URL. And this is actually because I don't have that much space, so it's even better to do that as an absolute URL. So you can even link to other systems. And now what's better about this approach here? The benefit we now get is that the client no longer has to assume how specific URIs are created. That it's always rooms / plus the ID. And when you want to follow that, you have to concatenate strings, like, right? You take rooms and then you take the ID out of the other response, and you don't want to do that because you want to follow that link here. Any questions so far? I forgot to mention, if you have any questions anytime, please just interrupt me and ask. Okay, that's good. And what else do we have for the links? That's one benefit, that we can now decouple the client from the server. So the client doesn't have to have this logic how the links are created. And another thing is, if we, for example, put a relation here, and the relation is now something the client knows, that the self relation relates to the object it resides in. So this has something to do with the room. And self relation means that this is now the resource of that room. Having that said, we can add a second link. For example, the action where to book that room. This may, in that case, be, for the sake of the example, the same URL. But now, if now you have another link, it's really like in a website. And this is the point of Hypermedia. You can now link to the resource where you can actually book that room for a specific number of persons. So if you think about that links, if you think about a website, now imagine that's Duke Ski Resort website, you as a human, and now what do you do? If you go to that website and you want to have contact information, you also don't open the website, take the HTML source code, scroll until you find some links, and then you copy paste the ID of that link into your URL's browser address bar and then hit enter. No, you follow the links, like on the website. That's how they're supposed to be used, right? And it's somewhat the same idea here for Hypermedia APIs. So what can we do here? If we want to provide the action where to book that room, we do so by including that in a link. And now if you have some crazy complex business logic around it, for example, we only want to be able to book a room if, well, the room is available, and if the, let's say, user has some credit on his account, and a lot of things may be taken into account. And now you can decouple that logic from the client as well, right? If you have a client, for example, a mobile app, and you have some book room button, right? And you only want to display that button if that complex business logic applies. And now, if you don't want to copy-paste that business logic into your client as well, and saying, well, client, only if room is available and if user something with a lot of queries, then display button. No, then here, using that approach, you can say, display that button and follow that action if and only if that link is there, right? And then you can decouple that from the client as well. Any questions?
What about the method, like post or?
Very good question. What about the method? How can we book that room? Because this is just the URL. Excellent question. And this is about another concept in Hypermedia. So here are the links. That is one concept. How can we link to some URL that we can call get on, like on a website, you follow links. And another thing is what is mostly called actions, where you say, okay, now we want to post to some resource and providing some information. And therefore, I want to give you another example, which is a little bit to right. So actually, this is then about Hypermedia-enabled content types. For example, this is an example I put on GitHub, showcasing another thing with an Amazon-like API where you can order books and so on and so forth. Let's make that a little bit bigger. And this shows the so-called Siren content type. There are some Hypermedia-enabled content types like Siren, Hydra, Hell, and so on and so forth, and they all support slightly different concepts. And why I chose this as a showcase example, it has, here you see, for example, some links. Now it's JSON, but it actually doesn't matter. It's just about the concept. And here you see some actions. And for example, add to cart. That's the action here. And what you're doing, you want to add, in that case, a book to the shopping cart by posting to that URL with that content type and these fields. So for our Duke ski resort, that would be please post to the URL, for example, bookings, or however you want to model that. Having that said, you want to name your URLs using nouns as they represent business objects, right? You don't write method names. Rather than what you do, you create a new booking, for example. So you say bookings and then post to these bookings. Using some information, for example, which room actually, so the room ID or some identifier, plus then the number of persons that you want to book for example. And this information, of course, has to be provided. And the question is, how does the client know which information they have to get? And this is one example. Using it directly in the response. So this is still the same response, like get room. You get one specific room, and it now provides you some options, like which links to follow and which actions, for example, here to perform. And it shows you how to use the book room action by providing all these information. And now what's the point? Now you decouple even more from the client how to access these actions. Now the client only needs to know what that relation, or here the name, is about. So of course this name has to be somewhat related to your client logic. And in that case, add to cart or book room is something specific the client has to know about, and where the information of the fields come from. For example, room ID or capacity, a number of persons you want to book the room for. And that is, of course, client logic. Because then for the number of persons, you can add a drop-down and so on and so forth, and the client obviously has to know where that information comes from. But the client then is no longer coupled to even the content type, to the URL and the method and so on and so forth. And you can evolve things on your server and change things on your server without breaking your client. Or you could introduce new optional fields and all that and so on and so forth. And as I said, you decouple more. And that's pretty much the point. And now the client knows how to use your API, but just looking at the response. And that's a nice story about it. Another nice side effect of that is you have to document less, right? In a Hypermedia API, you shouldn't have to write a lot of documentation actually, because ideally you just need to document your business objects. Like what is a room actually? What is a room ID? What means capacity and so on and so forth. Because everything how to use that API is already part of your API. So how that normally works is you provide some, like an entry page, like home page, and then you add some links. For example, here, that's a quite similar example. We are talking about books and orders and so on and so forth. You could add the link to all rooms and to all reservations, and then the client can follow this and get the list of all reservations, for example. And then look at the response, how can we actually modify them, or how can I create a new reservation? And then it only needs to know what that information is that has to be posted, for example. Any questions on that? Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
So if you have like a single page application,
Uh-huh.
and you navigate your client to say for instance the information page for one room,
Uh-huh.
then how would you go about loading that information without knowing how to build that URL? I mean, if you
Yeah, because did everybody, I hope so, get the question? You have to have, for example, the list of rooms first. So you have to follow links. And if that single page application using Angular, for example, or React, loads your page, then you can offer links, for example, list of all rooms, and then it can follow these links and get the response for one room, for example. Because you have to get to the room anywhere, right? Anyway, right? Because you're displaying some room. And then in order to follow that specific information, if you then, for example, want to book that room, you have to have that response earlier anyway. And then you can either cache it if it's about the URL and the actions you provide, or you have to reload it every now and then. Did I answer your question? Or?
What I mean is, for instance, if
No.
it has bookmarked
Uh-huh.
page
Yes.
and uses that as the entry point to
Mm-hmm.
the application, does that mean I would have to load the list of all rooms and then navigate that list until I get the...
Mm-hmm. No, if you're already on that page, then of course you could include the action on that page as well. So if you're on that page, which is then the response of one room, then that response of one room, as I showed here, includes the information. So this is now the list of rooms, but it actually doesn't matter. This could be one specific resource for one specific room, and it could contain the exact same information. Having that said, mostly the opposite is even the case, that in the list of all rooms you don't provide all the links and all the actions, because that would be mostly quite a big response. And then you only add the minimal set of informations you need to follow and to navigate, and then on the single resource of room you get all the things available. Okay, thanks for the question. Any other questions? Yes. Protocol in terms of HTTP?
Well, the API basically. I mean, the client has to know the specific API, right?
The client, exactly. The client has to know which, in that case, Hypermedia format is used, yeah.
It's not like a generic client can, just discover this and start booking rooms.
Yeah, not yet, because unfortunately nobody has agreed on a standard yet. That would be the case with HTML, for example, because HTML is kind of a standard of that Hypermedia format in some cases. Any other questions? Yes?
In the action example there, is there a way for the client to know how to fill in the ISBN?
Well, actually the client would have to know that, so you would have to implement that in the client. Of course, you could think of some even more generic option where you say, okay, this is exactly taken from the properties you just included in your, yes, you could do so, or you could enhance your Hypermedia content type and say, oh, where are they? My fields actually have something like a default value, and then you could pre-fill it from the server's response, for example. This is also possible. So this is not about a specific Hypermedia format, about a Hypermedia content type, but more about the concepts, what you could do. And you could perfectly well invent your own Hypermedia-enabled content type. So this is always how generic you want to be or how flexible you need to be. Any other questions on the basic things and the concepts about Hypermedia? Yes?
Regarding documentation,
Uh-huh.
you still need to provide documentation about all possible links response can contain, right?
Yes, exactly. You would need,
Documentation.
right, you would need all the list of relations. So obviously the client needs to know that. The client needs to know what does book a room mean. And then it needs to know that it has something to do with this relation. That's the only thing. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay, you can also ask later, because now if we get the concepts of Hypermedia, then we want to show some code, right? And implement that using Java EE, I hope. So who of you has been using JAX-RS? Very good, glad to hear that. And who of you has been using Maven to build only few? Oh, okay, yeah, that's better. Okay, because what we do here, we want to just live code ski resort, an example from scratch using Maven and Java EE7. And in order that you don't think I do some magic, I create everything from scratch. So what I just did on the command line was a small shell script that creates a Maven structure, something like a Maven archetype, but faster if you have a slow internet connection. So it just creates a default structure you need in order to do a Java E7 application. And this is the POM file of the Maven. It just includes the Java E7 API, which is provided. That's very important because then it doesn't end up in our WAR file. And that's basically it. And it contains the JAX-RS application. We need to bootstrap the JAX-RS, whole JAX-RS thing. If you have any question on that, feel free to ask. And now we want to include a new JAX-RS resource, right, for the books. Sorry, did I say books? That was the other example. Rooms. Even bigger font. That's okay. Okay, you're welcome. That's already the awful looking black and white thing for you guys, so you can read it better. Normally the darker theme is much better. Okay, now if you have any questions regarding JAX-RS, feel free to ask. This is the first example, which is basically the list of, yes? Question? No? Okay. Which is basically the list of rooms first. So we want to get the list of all rooms. And as this is a Java 7 application, we normally include some, let's call it room store or just resort, if I could spell, some EJB, which gets injected and then ask for all the rooms, get rooms, right? And these get returned. So we create a new class called room, which is just a pojo for now. So what we do, and that is where JAX-RS helpfully comes into play. JAX-RS can just map pojos to our output. In that case, we want to produce, let's say, JSON. So it produces media type application JSON. And then JAX-RS takes care of that. So what do? We create, first of all, our EJB and our pojo. So this will be the EJB. Therefore, we annotate it with stateless, right? And our room, which is our pojo, that gets, let's say, an ID and a name. And what did we have? We had the capacity of people, and that's it. Some getters and setters, and just to be convenient, a default and a custom constructor. Long ID, name, capacity, that's it. Pojo, nothing, no magic. And we have the EJB with the method getRooms, because now, yeah, the EJB get calls to give us some rooms. And as we now don't want to look more into the Java E part, but more on the JAX-RS part, we're just creating some rooms here as dummy objects. So actually, it doesn't matter. Normally, of course, we would load them from the database and so on and so forth. But we don't care for now. So now we create one room with an ID and some names and some capacities and so on and so forth. And these get returned. And then they get returned as a list. And the same is true if we want to include the resource method for one specific room, right? So now we want to get one room, which then gives us the ID, right? So that means, I think you know that from JAX-RS, path / rooms / ID, because these path annotations get concatenated together. And then we have get one room with now we can refer to the path param with the ID that can be injected to the method because we need to know that. And then we can ask the EJB in that case to give us a single room. For example, to load a single room with the database with one ID. Return new room, and now we want to fake that as well, because in that example it actually doesn't matter. And now we get one room back. So easy, because that's quite boring as it doesn't include anything Hypermedia yet, right? That's just a JAX-RS Hello World example. So what do we want to do here? As I showed in the, and this is about to be that example, as I showed here in the XML, not JSON, but it doesn't matter, we want to add that link, right? Because it's supposed to link to that specific room. And now we have several things we could do. We could either take our Pojo and enhance it for that case. So we could, for example, add a map here that adds a string to a URI, which is supposed to be the links map, right, with the relations to URI. So as we had here with the self relation to that URI and another one, and so on and so forth. So let's do that. No, this is not what I wanted to do. Hash map and this map and the getter and setter. And then we could add several things. For example, we could use JAXB to, need to the name, to rename this, and I could also say XML transient to, well, to control the output, how the XML or JSON looks like. This is just XML, but as a, well, workaround, because JSON-B, the API for JSON binding, is not final yet. It's actually supposed to be included in Java EE 8, but a few JSON mapping implementations take care of that. So you can actually write XML element and annotate that. And for example, Jackson will take care of that. And even if it's serialized to JSON, it will change that name here. And it works for most of the implementation. So that's actually a workaround if you don't want to include anything else than the Java E7 API. And having that said, now we have the links as a possibility to be added. And now we want to add and set actually the links here with the self relation. So what do? We have the list of rooms. And now we could, as we use Java E7 together with Java 8, using the stream API to say, for example, give me the list, the links map, and add something, add the, shouldn't talk and code at the same time, add the self relation with that self URI to that book. Sorry, to that room. Too much books. And now this is the URI that will be added. And now the question arises, how do we create that URI, right? Because we would need to concatenate, well, rooms/ID and so on and so forth, and that is quite cumbersome. And thankfully, JAX-RS offers something as a context-managed object that can be injected into JAX-RS resources called URI info. And that URI info can be used to programmatically create, well, URIs that point to resources. So if you ask URI info get base URI builder, then you have a, well, URI builder that can be used to create the paths to your resources. So this is the base URI to your application. And now we want to add the path. And of course we could say rooms, but this is, well, you repeated yourself because that information is already available up there at the add path annotation, right? So we don't want to do that. We want to say, actually, whatever is annotated to the room resource, please take that. So we can add the path to that resource, which basically takes the value of that annotation. And that can be also done with the path to some methods. As this, of course, only gives you room, and we want to have room slash 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in that case. So you can equally well reference to a method using the method name. And this will actually create then a URI pointing to that method room slash curly bracket ID curly bracket, which you do not want because you want the actual ID, right, as a path parameter. So fortunately, we can use some arguments here in the build method. For example, the room ID that gets then substituted for this path part. And then you finally get the URL with room slash 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And that's it. And now, of course, don't ever do that. We copy paste program, the same thing for the other method. We take the room, and then we add this to, where is it? The other copy paste part to that room. Any questions? Yes?
Can you do this, get room reference with an actual method reference?
Not as part of this API, actually. And it wouldn't make, well, it wouldn't make the whole thing better, because then what you would do, you would need to use reflection, right? And in that example, the server container does the reflection for you. So basically, it's the same thing as you would by pointing to a method, but then it's, well, more safe, I would say. But it wouldn't really matter. So what you could do, of course, you could use reflection and then take the string and put it there, but then the reflection is done twice. So no, you can't, but I would say that's not a big deal, is it? It's just...
It would be nice if the IDE could change the string if you rename the method.
Oh, you mean the IDE? I think at least IntelliJ, oh, that's a good question, we can try that. At least IntelliJ should be able, not because it knows, but because it searches for strings. Yeah, it actually asks you whether you want to rename that as well, just because IntelliJ looks for strings. But this somehow answers your question. Then IntelliJ would need to know about that relation. That could be theoretically done, but it's not done here. Very good question. Something else? Otherwise, we would just build and run it. Yes.
In this manner, you build in the relation into the code rather
Right.
than the resource. Isn't that the sort of a problem?
What do you mean, the relation to the code?
Yeah, the resource, resource method there
Mm-hmm.
correlates to a relation.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's, yeah, I know what you mean. That's because we're solely on the server side. And this is the same story. Of course, the server needs to know how the URIs are created. And the server needs to know that this is actually room slash take the ID and concatenate it. Of course, you're right, but that's server logic. What else could you do is like you provide 100 links and then you're unique 100 times, but that doesn't help you. But you don't provide that logic to the client. The client doesn't get the ID and needs to know how that is concatenated, it only gets the link. So this magic is solely done on the server. Yeah, very good question. Anything else? So I just built it using Maven, and since this is Java E7 with nothing else, it's really fast to build it. And we will then use, in my case, Wi-Fi to, well, deploy it. And the same story, it's a WAV file, which contains basically nothing, just the compiled class files and not the API. So it's faster than I could talk, already deployed. And then, of course, we could use whatever REST client you like. I use curl on the command line just because I can. Duke Ski Resort. So as this is HTTP, you can use whatever you like, right? Python, Postman, it's normally taken. Resources, this was the name of the JAX-REST application, and now if we use some fancy bash scripting magic, we can pretty print it using JSON. So now what do we have? We have this JSON response of the rooms, of the list of rooms, with our ID, the name, capacity, and here, that's a nice story, the links. And now you can just equally well follow it for the single resource, right? And actually another nice story of JAX-RS is if you use another domain, and this is what that's in my local host file, so this is also localhost, but now the link that comes out changes as well, because that was the reason why I used the get base URI builder. Now JAX-RS takes your actually request into account and incorporates that for providing the URL, which is super helpful if you, what normally the case, provide a proxy server up front. And then the real URL, as passed from the client, gets incorporated into the constructed URLs. And it's a quite helpful thing from JAX-RS as well. Any questions? Okay, then I will provide a short other example, because now what did we do? We took a POJO and let it serialize to JSON or XML or whatever. And now, of course, if you have a more sophisticated output like this one, then you could imagine this is quite cumbersome to do by mapping it to Java types, right? And the same is true if you want to have a more flexible output, actually. If you say, for that case, we want to include this property and not, and then you actually have to, you quite get limited by this declarative approach of mapping your information. So what we can actually do, and this is why I'm using Java E7, because it's incorporated with the other expert group I'm working in called JSONP, Java API for JSON processing, which is a helpful functionality to create JSON objects programmatically. And guess what? JAX-RS knows about that API, and if you, for example, return a JSON object, it knows that it's automatically be mapped to JSON. So how does it work? We take the list of rooms again here and say, give me the rooms. We ask the EJB again, and now actually using lambdas and streams, we want to map these rooms to something else. So now please, and this is the URL logic that can stay actually. Now please create JSON.createObjectBuilder, and this creates an object builder, and with a builder pattern like fashion, you can now add a name from, well, the room get name, and you can add something else, a capacity, not this one, but the other one, and you can add, what do we have, the links, for example. We had the nested object for the links, so we can add another JSON object builder, and now it gets funny, to add a nested object, like links, which is now a self link, right, that points to the self URI. And JSONP doesn't know about URI, so we have to call .toString. And by doing so, we adding this object, so which, yeah, here I am, .build. What did I do? I just created a JSON object using that builder approach, and at the end you call .build, and that gets returned in my Lambda, right? Which means that this map function over there, and now if we pretty print it, we can see the output, maps the stream of rooms to a stream of JSON objects. And now having that said, we can collect the stream of JSON objects using another collector called createArrayBuilder to a JSON array, because I was typing without thinking. I want to actually return a JSON array, which is basically a JSON array. And having included all these JSON objects, right? And JSON array builder, and now using the fancy Lambda and method references, we can add the whole thing to a JSON array, and then just return it. And this is now a JSON array builder, and by calling .build, it gets built into a JSON array. Questions? Yes?
Aren't you breaking content negotiation by hard coding JSON?
Theoretically, yes. I'm now not really able to do the content negotiation. If I would want to, I could do so by selecting specific response types, content types here. But I would say as you want or as you need to commit to a specific Hypermedia-enabled content type, you need to commit on something anyway, right? So the client needs to know about, let's say, Siren with JSON, and then your API can only consume doing so. It's the same story for HTML, right? Of course, you could argue, now I could provide the same thing using XML, but why, right? So then you would need to do that twice, or you need to, I mean, you could do the same using a huge POJO mapping, right? A huge POJO hierarchy, but I would say that doesn't add that much value, right? So of course, yeah, you're kind of committing to JSON here, but yeah, that's actually true, but I wouldn't say that doesn't help much. So what do we do here? We just shortly, we ask the EJB to give us a list of rooms. We map that to a stream of rooms. We map the stream of rooms to a stream of JSON objects using that logic to create JSON objects programmatically, and the URI is using the same logic with the URI info as before. And then at the end, we have the stream of JSON objects, and we incorporate that to a so-called JSON array builder. By calling .build at the end, we get a JSON array, and that gets returned. And now, since I'm running out of time, I'm only doing this example, not the other one, but fortunately, Java EE is quite fast to redeploy and run, to rebuild and run. And then if we want to ask our rooms again, we can start it, we can do so. And now it's the same story. Yeah, you see the difference because it has no ID, and now it was created using JSONP. And of course, you now get the story that this was just a simple example, but now you have the capability to do all the kind of crazy complex return types you want by providing these informations programmatically. No questions? Okay. Why would you want to do that? Normally somebody complains and said, well, now you just have all this information twice because it's included in your POJO already. Yeah, that's true. But I would argue this information, you of course wouldn't code it like that, rather than you would outsource all that logic here into a single point of responsibility. For example, a CDI managed bean, right? That then, like entity builder, that then gets injected in your JAX-RS resource and asks, please build me a JSON object for that specific object. And then you at least have the all that logic in one point. And as it turned out, and as we saw that often in enterprise projects, and we see it every time in the workshops I'm organizing, if you do hypermedia, then you very fast get to the point where the declarative mapping, for example, POJOs with some annotations mapped to links and all that, doesn't help you that much, and you need more flexibility, for example, in order to control these links, right? How they can control the workflow rather than just with the declarative approach. And then you need more flexibility anyway, and then I would argue, okay, that's the simplest approach, actually using Java EE 7 APIs only. I didn't include any mapping framework or any fancy magic. It's just all included in Java EE 7. And by doing so, you actually, I would say, have the fastest way to build that Hypermedia-enabled APIs. Any questions? Yes.
How the client consume the links you just created?
Yeah, that's a very good question. How does the client consume that? Because it's just on the server side. Yeah, the client actually has to have a simple engine that knows the Hypermedia content type. I mean, for links, it's quite simple. You just tell them where to find the links, for example, by convention with the _links object. And then the client knows about some specific relations. And then it just follows them using HTTP. And the same is true, although more complex for the actions. And as an example, as I'm running out of time, I can show that. But I have a GitHub project, Jax4S Hypermedia. And I actually also I can show you. I created a video course with a couple of episodes, and the last one is about that specific thing, the client side. Because I included I once coded a small, I wouldn't call it framework, but a small client that actually does exactly this logic, how to consume and follow these actions. Of course, it's some implementation you would have to include first to be generic enough to use all that Hypermedia logic, right? But if you have, I would say, a huge API, or if your API is consumed by a lot of different clients, then it makes sense to use Hypermedia first, so you are actually flexible enough. And then it also pays off if you build this kind of engine into your client, on the client side as well, whichever technology you're using, right? For example, Java. And if you're interested, you can have a look at that GitHub project called Jax4S Hypermedia, and it has some basic client examples on this Amazon bookstore. Thanks for the question. So I think we're totally out of time, so thanks a lot for your attention.